Good morning and welcome to the next subchapter of my novel of Letting Go, and the title is Rhythm. The next morning, René set out to research the meaning of mesothelioma. He quickly landed on legal sites fighting for the rights of mesothelioma patients. He learned that it was a typical disease that could result from employees or workers being exposed to asbestos in the workplace. So he looked for mesothelioma cases in Feeny's work environment. Was there asbestos contamination in the office building where she rented her space or where she had her studio set up? Even an initial, superficial search in Google, in which he had only entered the words asbestos rental office Manchester, brought up a whole list of entries. And these were not just any links to topics such as medical reports and the like, but even without having added the term cancer, several articles immediately caught his eye, which in turn brought to light legal cases in which employees had contracted this type of cancer due to asbestos exposure in the old and only partially renovated office buildings. One article lamented the fate of a younger man in his prime who had died from lung cancer, probably caused by asbestos, and who worked in a building not far from where Feeny and her workshop were housed. René didn't dare continue reading when he recognized the neighboring building in pictures where Feeny's office was located. Without being inclined to jump to conclusions, he searched for further reports. It said that the entire building complex had only recently been cleared of asbestos. However, her studio did not appear to be located in an asbestos-exposed district. At least he found no mention of these industrial buildings. Should there be a link to Feeny's illness? However, the obvious long incubation period that such asbestos exposure had argued against this. He and Feeny had moved to Manchester in 1994 after he had accepted the offer from the consultancy company, but had initially continued to run her fashion workshop with her employees and her massage studio in Munich, and from a distance with commuting. It wasn't until he had set up his own business in Manchester 3 years later that Feeny wanted to be in Manchester more often to support him, and that she had opened a fashion boutique in the industrial area and another massage studio in the city center in the hotel district. That was just 13 years ago. And asbestos incubations often only broke out after 20, 30, or 40 years. In addition, Feeny did not spend long periods in the workshop working on the designs from home and often from her unique office. The more he read, calling up new pages, discarding others, and working his way through the information, he realized that it would be unlikely if she had fallen ill because of her job in Manchester, even if it couldn't be ruled out. In order to make Feeny not worried, he decided not to tell her about the possibility or about his research and his initially rather negative assumptions. Instead, he wrote to a friend of many years, Raj, who also lived in Manchester and whose two children were the same age as hers, as well as a daughter and an older son. He told him of his initial concerns, but then also that he hardly expected the possibility of the disease in this location being created. Raj encouraged him and based his research insights on his own experience, especially as he had been a director of a large company in Manchester for a long time. He had experience of asbestos exposure and its removal from workplaces, including claims from sufferers and their families. The only thing that worried him were the reports about the obviously less than professional asbestos removal from buildings while they were still in operation. But he was also aware that such asbestos-related illness had a long lead time, and he tried to reassure René that it was necessary to wait for further investigations and, if only to protect Feeny, not to set an uncontrollable ball rolling with claims against the office landlord. René leaned back in his desk chair. He took a breath after the phone call and made a conscientious resolution to conduct the background search with even more caution and less stubbornness, and instead to be guided more by the advice, questions, and answers of the oncologist treating Feeny. That was easier to reflect on in his head than to dictate his feelings and guts. Inwardly, he was already seething at the thought that the workplace, of all places, could have contributed to the illness. He had accepted that Feeny needed the space to store bowls of fabric, pin designs to the walls, outfit, dress, and choreography of the models, and receive fashion clients. And he had come to terms with the fact that she continued to receive massage clients in the studio because she wanted to give him the chance to build up his own business and cover a good part of her expenses. His own income from the venture that was being set up would not have been enough, and Feeny was adamant to contribute to the finance of his startup. Then his common sense kicked in and told him not to let himself be driven by wafting internet bubbles. He closed the computer with a resounding bang, and he left his study and checked on Feeny, who was sitting in the living room in front of the monitor she was using as a TV substitute. Feeny had wrapped herself in a blanket. He sat down next to her on the sofa, leaning against her to feel her closeness and possibly make her feel his. When the program was interrupted by a commercial, Feeny suddenly woke up in shock, looked at him, and asked in astonishment, "What are you doing here? You're not interested in soap series, are you?" "That's true," Renee replied, "but I'm interested in you, and I missed you. I wanted to feel your warmth." She beamed at him a little uncertainly and even took his hand. "I'm sorry," she said, "if I sometimes react dismissively." "Feeny, it helps me when you say that, but I know how little part you played in it. I even feel guilty when you feel sorry for me and think you have to apologize." "You say that. I sometimes suffer more from seeing you suffer than from my own pain. And I feel the way you do. It's like a turbine because your pain hurts me more than my own worries and fears. And if you suffer twice as much, I suffer even more, and then you suffer even more because of me." Renee noticed how Feeny flinched, and for which she had always admired her. She had a sober turnaround, got up, went to her little antique cupboard, took out one of the older whiskies, 2 glasses, and poured. He knew that she never actually drank whiskey. If she ever drank stronger alcohols, it was a glass of cognac. But she wanted to do him a favor and show him that she was getting involved with him. She had an inkling of what was going on inside Renee. "Look, the findings could have been worse. Whether mesothelioma, high grade or low grade, the doctors have given me a treatment option. And as you said, we're together. Cheers." Feeny had completed 4 weeks of chemotherapy. The effect of the drugs on Feeny's condition were as predicted by the doctors and the Macmillan nurse. On the day she was given chemotherapy, preceded by antihistamines, she was initially drowsy after the session, then sleepy for the rest of the day. For this reason alone, it made sense for Renee to accompany Feeny and help her get through this ordeal. In the evening, she was almost unresponsive, went straight to bed and slept through the night until late the next morning. Then, however, she was surprisingly awake, talked, wanted breakfast, and soon afterwards sat down at her desk, especially as she had learned after the first week that she only had this day and the next to get on with her work, pushing ahead with her plans, studying design drafts, keeping in touch with fabric producers, answering emails, receiving the children at home in the afternoon, and discussing school and homework with them. These were the 2 evenings a week when they were able to lead a halfway normal life together. On the third day, she was struck down by nausea. Although there were harbingers, they began during the night. Feeny woke up, zapped through the channels on her iPad until she found some soap opera program, which she watched in bed for hours, one episode after another, some episodes more than once. Renee got up more often and made Feeny a cup of tea with fresh ginger, which reduced her nausea sometimes. She comforted herself and him by pointing out that her fellow patients, whom she had met in the chemo outpatients clinic and who were also being treated in the same Icon 8 trial with a weekly regime, reported considerably stronger side effects. That they had to vomit several times a day and at night. Others felt a stinging sensation in their fingertips, which was annoying. For others, so painful that they had to reduce the amount of chemo administered. She knew that this reduced their chances of losing the tumor or reducing it in size. She tried to get through these difficult days as well as possible with home remedies. At her request, Renee scoured the internet for relevant studies on how to change her diet during chemo so that she would feel less nausea without negatively affecting the therapy. Fortunately, Annika's university access from olden times still was given to Feeny, and so they had access to medical studies that non-scientists would normally not have access to. In order to make the findings available to others, he created a blog on which he summarized the nutritional and medical studies he had found in relevant journals over the past few years. It was revealing to see what these had to say about nutrition during standard therapy for ovarian cancer with carboplatin and paclitaxel. Rennie, who had always been the chef at home more often than Feeny, used to change the family's eating habits. The studies advised against consuming grapefruit and related products, as there was strong evidence that these had negative impact on the effectiveness of the chemotherapy. The consumption of dairy products was also discouraged, which was explained by the fact that ovarian cancer is often linked to estrogen hormones, and milk is the product of a cow with an increased estrogen content. Conversely, studies have shown that green tea, and even more so white tea, with its concentration of free radicals, which in contrast to black tea can support the therapy due to the lower fermentation. Green or white tea was preferable to black coffee, even though the studies on coffee showed that it obviously had neither a positive nor a negative influence on therapy. Of course, it was more generally known that green vegetables such as kale, broccoli, and the like would also promote cancer therapy due to the free radicals. So the family changed slightly their diet, replacing coffee with white tea, reducing dairy products or choosing olive spreads instead, increasing the choice of vegetables for meals, and the children also joined in once they understood why some things were eaten less often and others now more often. Nevertheless, the change was not easy for the children, especially as their school diet was different and not very healthy. Renee and Feeny had always been upset about this, but they had not been able to get the school management to change anything. Why? When they picked up the children from the afternoon, were these kids being given a bag of potato chips, as the school says, as tea, in addition to a sandwich with white toast with the crust cut off and a slice of ham and cheese on top? How were children who were used to such a fast food diet every day supposed to enjoy raw food in the evening? The waves of agonizing nausea lasted for 3 days, during which Feeny was condemned to doze in her bed with a window darkened. Every now and then she would wake up and switch on her iPad, watch another series, but usually fell asleep again after a few minutes, rarely remembering what she just had seen. She hardly wanted to eat anything. Renee provided supplies of further ginger tea or, for a change, ginger with lemon in hot water. took the children to school, picked them up again, ran errands to pharmacies, to the market, and tried as best as he could to concentrate on work at his desk. Driving in the office in between, trying to keep up to date, attending team meetings, more absent-minded than attentive. He was grateful to his partner, Talon, took almost all the responsibility and work off his hands, and was the only thing he had to do was to email him when he was unavailable because of Feeny's care. Talon was actually the junior partner, but he had developed into the senior partner in just a few days and gave Renee the feeling that he was allowed to look after his wife whenever necessary. And Feeny organized her workshops during her 2 working days, cancelled massage appointments because she needed to take care of her body. Then, like a miracle, Feeny always woke up on the 4th day after chemo, beamed at Renee, started talking to him in bed, and soon turned over to take her flashcards from the bedside table. Since the days of their studies, and also since the time they were together, it was a daily routine that Renee was making coffee, now tea, and they studied languages together. She learned Italian and English, so central to communicating with suppliers and fashion houses. She also learned a wide variety of fashion designs from designers of the past years and decades. She wanted to have the fashion world at her fingertips precisely because she was developing her own approach in the knowledge of everything that had gone before. And above all, she was interested in the extent to which fashion corresponded with home furnishings and art, and how the whole ensemble was a mirror of the needs of a time, and even more, a driving force for the development of self-understanding and taste. While she cultivated her languages and her historical knowledge of fabrics, designs, and color combinations, René immersed himself in business plans with new ideas that reached their investment boutique, as it was called in England, every week. What foreign languages and letters were for Feeny, business models and their numerical frameworks were the challenge for René. They both benefited from their different worlds. René was proud of what Feeny created in fashion and systematically built up as a project. Her treasure trove of artistic creation and knowledge through all the periods and around the globe, especially the African, South American, and Asian collections. Feeny asked René from time to time when she couldn't get on alone with issues such as financing, planning, and taxes. So the 4th morning brought a little normality to their daily routine. Feeny was satisfied, although she wasn't able to memorize her cards so quickly because, as she said, she couldn't yet work with full concentration. She was able to do what she liked to do, and she had the impression that she was succeeding, albeit with some reduced results. René could hardly believe that after 3 days of darkness, the sun was suddenly shining into their bedroom again. They could hug in bed, kiss good morning, and he could prepare breakfast for them while Feeny was in the bathroom. In the meantime, Alina and Jan were back at the household with them, and the children were visibly happy to see Mum sitting at the breakfast table again. After breakfast, he took Alina and Jan to school in the car, while Feeny went straight to her desk to catch up on what had been left undone for 3 days. When he came back from school, he was amazed to see that Feeny had even cleared the breakfast table, organized the kitchen, and put the family laundry in the washing machine. She was like transformed. It was a grotesque life experience. 2 days before the chemo and 1 day after the chemo, they led a largely unimpaired life as a family. While Feeny had to let her cancer subjugate her again on chemo day and then stood or lay beside herself for 3 days. René was unsure whether he should speak to her about her previous experience on the 2 better days. When he tried to do so, he was rebuffed by Feeny, who said that she was just happy to have escaped cancer during these 2 days. When he suggested they go for a little walk together, to which she agreed, she couldn't get a word out except to ask him not to ask. René accepted. took her in his arms, and they walked together in silence through the green fields on the outskirts of Manchester, gazing into the light mist, strolling along the red brick houses built in rows like a modern city wall. Lord Halifax is said to have made the building boom of the late 19th century possible with his 100% financing. He had also made it possible for less well-off families to buy a small house. And each one had a small garden with at least one fruit tree. They themselves lived in one of these cottages, which had been extended with others in their street to form a complex of houses that had previously served as a municipal home for orphans. The advantage of their lives, especially at that time, was that they didn't have to look after the small front garden, which was part of the complex and maintained by a team of gardeners. As in the previous 4 weeks, they boarded the train to the chemo outpatient clinic at the University Hospital that morning. Feeny seemed more tired than in the weeks before. She looked out of the train window. Suddenly, she turned to Renee. Do you think the therapy is working? That the tumor marker has gone down? She burst out, and Renee guessed why she had come so silent since the previous afternoon. Renee thought about how he should answer the question. From what he could find on the internet, the prognosis was anything but encouraging. Women with ovarian cancer in their stage who underwent such therapy only responded with a significant or partial improvement in their tumor situation in around 30% of the cases. A further percentage of women showed a halt in growth of the tumor, but in an astonishingly high proportion of patients, the cancer simply continued to grow unhindered. How open should he be with Feeny so as not to demotivate her? At that moment, she already seemed so desperate that he didn't dare mention the sober figures. Thank you for addressing what has probably been bothering you so much since yesterday, but it's not easy for me to answer, said Renee. Why? She asked. Is it so bad for me? Believe me, sometimes the fear jumps out of me, overpower me, and won't let go. Then it just gets dark around me, inside me, and wonder why I'm even sitting on the train to sit in the chair soon afterwards. And during the needle, the chemo, the day afterwards, tell me, do you think it's worth it? Oh dear, Feeny, I can't even put myself in your shoes, but I suspect I can feel you being afflicted. You know, I'm not a doctor, but as far as the prognosis for therapy is concerned, there's at least a little hope. If you add up the cases in which the therapy brings about a cure, an improvement, or at least a cessation of the disease growth, you have, say, a 50-50 chance, which sounds terribly small and uncertain, but that's the chance you and we have. And you, she replied, what do you think? I'm a little more optimistic than these figures, because the vast majority of patients who form the basis of these figures are considerably older than you, often suffering from other illnesses, while you were athletic, fit, and otherwise healthy before the operation. So I hope and think you've got a better chance, but we'll see. Today, after the fourth chemo, we will be told for the first time what the tumor marker is after the first three chemotherapies. Before the operation, it stood at 1,200. After the operation, it was already down to 700. Yes, but the normal range, Feeny said, of the CA125 is 25. It's not 700 and not 1,200. It's 25 and less. Renee replied, okay, that's a long way to go. She had turned her head back to the window, which only allowed the black brick walls of the train tunnel to shine through as it whizzed past. Feeny obviously wanted to end the subject. After a few stops, they finally arrived, got out, and went to their cafe. Unlike the first weeks, Feeny didn't want to drink and just sat quietly at the table. Renee sat with her. You take something, she said. You don't have to go to the chemo. The tone was cutting. Renee didn't dare to get up, sensed the insecurity and fear that was rumbling inside Feeny, and felt her subliminal reproach towards him, the healthy one. She was the sick one, who wondered why she, of all people, had ended up in this predicament. Why not him, who was 7 years older than her? Go, she urged him further. Why should you crawl around when I'm miserable? Rene was not exactly relieved and motivated to get himself a coffee. Shall we get some fresh air instead? No, said Feeny, and told him once again to get a coffee. Rene got up, went to the counter, and ordered an Americano. The hot cup was pressed into his hand. He paid and turned around, but the table where Feeny had just been sitting was empty. In a flash, he thought Feeny might have left the cafe, but then he calmed down and thought she had probably just gone to the toilet. But then he noticed that her jacket had also disappeared from the chair, as had her handbag, which she always carried with her, with all her utensils with which she could have been admitted to hospital, a precautionary measure that she had learned from fellow patients. Rene panicked, left the Americano on the counter, grabbed his jacket and bag from the table and ran outside. He looked left and right. Feeny had disappeared without a trace. He had a choice. Had she run to the left towards the hospital and the chemo clinic, or to the right back to the train? Intuitively, he decided to run the way they had come. He reached the corner of the street, looked on all sides, ran on towards the train, and spotted Feeny in a crowd of people at the next set of pedestrian lights, which had turned red. He dashed off just as she was about to march off. He reached her in the middle of the street. She looked at him in astonishment, her eyes wide open, her hair tousled like a madman. At first she kept walking, then she ran away from him. He caught up with her again. Leave me alone, she shouted. The people around her looked up. Some stopped and seemed to wonder whether they should intervene. But as Renee was not violent, they went on their way. Let me go, she screamed again, and she ran past the train station, crawled into the entrance of a company building with her back against the wall, sank down and crouched on the floor. Renee didn't want to be with her, didn't want to stand over her, didn't want to confront her, but he thought better sat down to her on the dirty company floor. I can't let you go, Feeny. I'd like to listen to you, to understand you. You don't understand anything. Well, I'm trying. She stared in front of her, picked herself up and ran off again. He followed behind. One street corner, another, and another. She ran around the block. He had lost his bearings. She ran until she stopped, exhausted, panting and gasping for breath, her hands on her knees bent over. I can't. I don't want to anymore. If you don't think about yourself, don't think about me. At least think about Alina and Jan, Renee told her, because he didn't know what else to do and to say. At least try this one more time. And let's find out the tumor marker today. If it's bad, then yes, let's go and let it go. But why throw everything away now, before we know whether the therapy is helping? She didn't answer. She remained bent over, shaken, tears running down her cheeks, dripping onto her hands. Renee couldn't hold on any longer, grabbed one of her hands, and tears dripped onto his hands too, hers and his. The tears mingled and ran down his legs. He felt her lie down at his side, the strength of her legs failing. And before she sank into herself, he grabbed her other arm and pressed her against him. Her tears continued to flow, now onto his shirt, his chest. She shook her head, tried to catch herself, dug her forehead into his breastbone. Just this one more time, she whispered. Just this one more time. One more time. They remained huddled together in silence for a while, intertwined. The world around them must have stood still in the meantime. They heard no traffic noise, no ambulance, sirens, no train noises. It was dead quiet around them. Sorry, she said. Don't tell the children. Renee showed her his approval. Sometimes it's so terrible, unbearable. The fear, not the needle. The tiredness, the coma. The fear of the result. I'll hardly notice numbers. You need to listen carefully. Sorry for me too. I have no idea how, if I can help you. I feel like I can't reach you, which makes me helpless and feel guilty. That's how I feel. I have no strength. I'm empty and I feel bad when I think about the children, when I think about you. There was another pause. They sat next to each other on the ground again. The feet of passers-by marched. Past them, the wheels of cars rolled along. Let me try again, Feeny breathed. Taking a step. Where do we have to go? And she looked at him. He was at a loss, just thinking, I don't know. No matter where we go, every step helps, and we found out where we are and where we need to go at the next crossroads. She trudged along with him, keeping close to him. At the next crossroad, there was a traffic light. An arrow pointed to the hospital. They followed the arrow and soon saw the small entrance to the outpatient chemo clinic. Can you still tell that I've been crying? Asked Feeny in uncertainty, looking at Renee. Your cheeks are still red, but I saw so many women in the waiting room last time who had red heads. I don't think yours will stand out. Renee had noticed the faces of the chemo patients who had lost all their other body hair as well as their scalp hair, including the fine hair on their skin and their brows. Feeny still had her hair, but it probably wouldn't be long before she lost it. He didn't want to think any further. Feeny took a deep breath and dragged herself weakly up the stairs to the chemo clinic waiting room after the desperate escape. Procedure began. Sign in, name and date of birth, a number like the pin on the back of the credit card. They had arrived just in time for her chemo appointment. She was immediately allocated a free chair in the middle of the larger room, and the round stool was placed next to her. Here the waiting began. Feeny dug her cell phone out of her bag, put the headphones in her ears, and started watching a video. Renee held her hand and didn't dare take his laptop or a book out of his bag. When he tried to occupy himself the week before, he received a stern and punishing look and a question as to whether he couldn't or wouldn't want to take care of her. Wow, how exhausting she was. This time, he had to wait until she was fast asleep. It took a long time. She was too upset. Then she nodded off. Renee waited in the chair. Nothing happened at first. Other patients were sitting around him, some with partners like him, others with mothers and relatives. Nurses walked back and forth. Eventually, one of them came to him, tried to wake Feeny up and answer her confirmation questions, because otherwise she wouldn't be allowed to start the procedure. Name, date of birth. Renee wanted to answer, but he wasn't allowed. Feeny had to provide the correct information herself because of the strong medication. Feeny struggled to find an answer. The nurse looked for a vein, tapped on her right arm, which already showed blue punctures, tapped on her left arm, which looked no different from the frequent blood withdrawals, the earlier chemos. At one point, she pricked it, drew some blood, attached a butterfly to the needle, and connected it to the cannula and the tube that led to the bottle on the stand. Inserted the automatic regulator between them, switched it on, and ran a first solution of water through it. Sometime later, after the blank solution had been found, the same questioning started again. Name, date of birth, as if the patient in the chair had changed. She was still the same. She was still Feeny, still 41 years old, still married, still had 2 children, was still a fashion designer whose fame was already not insignificant. But here she got the feeling that she was nothing more than name and the date of birth, just a cancer patient. As soon as the bag of the antihistamines was finished, her voice became quieter. Her eyelids had not closed completely, but her breathing became calmer, and she seemed to doze off and was soon asleep. He sat on his stool for several hours, paying attention to the dripping solution, the ticking of the machine. He also dozed, almost falling off his stool. Finally, his hand came away from hers. He opened his bag, pulled out his laptop, tried to read at first, to distract himself, to concentrate on the text in front of him. After some time, he made an effort to write the first lines. Nothing strenuous, revised some text. He didn't want to look into the future, didn't want to wonder how many of his papers or business reports he would have to write in a chemo ward or at the bedside. Didn't want to imagine the path between hope and nightmare, between up and downhill. Again and again, he was torn away from what he was reading, writing, getting tangled up in what he had just buried himself in. Like Feeny, her movies, he had to read most of the pages twice or 3 times. The text just didn't come to him. But he wanted to continue, if only for her sake. He couldn't be less patient than Feeny. He wanted to do some work while Feeny fought in silence. Every now and then he looked around the room. He was horrified. Across from Feeny sat a hairless woman, barely older than 18. Next to her was a handbag half open, the torn open packet of cigarettes peeking out. To her right, a corpulent older lady had just sat down while she waited for the first questioning. She pulled out a packet of potato chips, the smell of the fat alone making him nauseous. Obviously, she couldn't take the food for long either. She retched. A nurse brought her a cardboard tray and the potato chips went the other way. It was mostly older women who sat on the chairs. However, he also noticed another young woman. Her hair dyed purple, her arms tattooed up to her neck. She had just sat down on the chemist's chair, their eyes crossed. She smiled, hopefully at him, and he smiled encouragingly back. She gave him thumbs up. Sitting on the stool next to her was an aged man whose features resembled hers. Then thought flashed through Renee's mind of what it could be like if Lena were sitting next to Feeny and Jan next to her. If the whole family were to fall ill with cancer, the night could always get darker. As if black could be increased. Cancer seemed to be able to do the impossible. Again, his thoughts had wandered from his lines in front of him, stuck on Feeny, on the children. He couldn't get rid of these horrors. Looked after Feeny. She was asleep. What to hold on? The children were a support, but he couldn't burden them with the details, even if he tried to be transparent with them, neither giving them more hope than they had, nor transferring his fears onto them. He did not have the strength yet to fall back on his friends. The regular visits from the mother of Alina's best friend helped. Here was a woman who just came, who was just there. She listened, lent a hand here and there, had the right eye and was reliable opening to the outside world. The business and investment meetings, the meetings with his colleagues, he followed them dully. They were as distant to him at times as the lines in front of him. The world around him seemed to have a life of its own. Being in the chemo outpatient clinic with Feeny made it clear to him that although he was sitting there without antihistamines, without chemo fluid, and without the metastases, he was also fighting. He was somehow infected by all of this. Here he sat, trying desperately to hold onto the stool, but he didn't know where to reach. Feeny needed support, and even on the few days when she was halfway herself, he couldn't lean on her, who was just halfway on her own feet and legs. It had been long weeks since the diagnosis, since the operation, since the first chemos. And suddenly it weighed down on him. His fingers stopped moving. The keys on the laptop seemed to be sticky with honey. He sank to his knees, and the darkness that only a few minutes ago had cast Feeny down on the street hit him inside. The chemo room darkened. He felt himself slipping. And panic-stricken, he reached for Feeny's hand, felt the butterfly, was startled and suddenly wide awake again. Did I pull the cannula out of your vein? His gaze was fixed on the butterfly, looking for signs that it had slipped, but it seemed to be firmly in place, fortunately, attached to the arm by a tight band of a fabric. Feeny was asleep, and time passed infinitely slowly. Waiting time stretches. It's the opposite of free time. Forced prolongation of life where one longs for an end just to prolong life. He had taken a book out of Feeny's bag. Annika had given it to her. It was a collection of texts by the medieval philosopher and theologian Meister Eckhart. He had come across him once before during a business seminar offered by a consulting firm on the subject of time management. The speaker was a bit a new age type, spoke about the importance of the now. He mentioned this medieval thinker who considered eternity and concrete life to be one and the same. At first, René couldn't do much with this now. It sounded too much like an unspeakable no, preceded by the N, for saying no, not normality. The medieval ascetic seemed to have no sense of anything positive. He himself felt that the N denied him what he had previously considered to be the purpose of life, namely Z for time. T for time with Feeny, T for time with the children, time for himself. Time not as a yardstick for things not only pass, but time as a space that could be filled with experiences, even everyday ones. The consultant, it seemed to him, had no idea of a stretch now, an unbearable now, that would not come to an end. He had probably never sat at the side of a life partner whose life was stretched from waiting room to waiting room and whose now was so stretched that it diluted almost the point of demolition. Time, it seemed to him, was insubstantial, immoderate, at least in his life, out of joint. How little control did he still have over his life? He was at the mercy of this little bit, Feeny in a different way to him, the children in a different way to both. From time to time, he glanced at the oversized clock hanging above the door of the room. It seemed to be standing still. Was it an optical illusion that it was running backwards? Time even seemed to have lost its direction, jumping and foxing the clock. René woke up because his laptop had crashed to the floor. A nurse had shaken him by the arm and offered him a small bottle of water. "Sir, you need to drink something," she said. "You look bad, very pale." His hand reached for the bottle, but he couldn't open the screw cap. The nurse opened the bottle for him. "You don't need to worry about your wife. She'll sleep soundly for another hour or two. I'll renew her chemo wrap. But how about stretching your legs for half an hour? There's a kiosk downstairs where you can buy an apple or potato chips. That will help you." René felt his stiff lower legs, his thighs. He pulled himself together and moved outside. He was too weak to say goodbye to Feeny. To encourage him, the nurse had sat on his stool after she had renewed the chemo pack. With a glance at her, he stepped onto the stairs and went outside. Let's get some air first, he thought. He didn't feel any desire for an apple or potato chips. Lost, René walked along the path where he had been looking for Feeny a few hours earlier. What would he have said to the children if they had come back that day without chemotherapy? What would have happened if Feeny hadn't gone to the clinic after all? How often would such a scene be repeated? He made his way to the traffic lights, to the place where the turning point occurred. It didn't matter to him whether it was exactly this traffic light or another, the same place or somewhere else. He looked for the turnaround, looked for the change himself. Thought about whether he could have done something differently in advance, whether he could have done to prevent it. And he thought so about the future. With a heavy heart, he made his way back to the clinic building. With the nurse's advice in his ear, he bought an apple and a cappuccino. After strengthening himself, he climbed the stairs, entered the chemo room, and saw that Feeny was still asleep on a chemo chair. A little relieved, his gaze wandered to the chemo pack, from which the last remnants were slowly oozing out drip by drip, supported and controlled by the machine. He took a seat on his chemo stool again. The bag was still in place, Feeny too. Scraps of scenes were already circulating in his mind that would soon play out when the ward doctor came to tell them about the tumor marker. The scenes broke off because the nurse stepped up to Feeny and unhooked the bags, pulled the butterfly cannula out of Feeny's arm and gestured to him. Let your wife rest a little longer. She will wake up soon. Then let me know and I'll send the ward doctor to discuss the tumor marker with you. René only heard tumor marker and also that he should give Feeny some time. And she actually woke up slowly soon afterwards, looking a little sleepy at first, then a little unsure, until she realized that René was sitting next to her. You slept a bit, said René, but your chemo is over. However, you should rest, the nurse said. Feeny closed her eyelids again, then opened them again shortly afterwards. Her gaze was already fixed between doubt, worry, and fear. When's the doctor coming? She said, surprisingly alert. I can't wait any longer. It was a clear sign. Renee squeezed her hand again, stood up, and turned to the nurse who had unplugged Feeny. Back at Feeny's chair, he sat down because he already suspected that the doctor would not be arriving anytime soon. He was not wrong about that. On the other hand, it was good because Feeny was waking up more and more. Renee began to talk about something which she tried to follow, even though she was still struggling to listen and speak. Until the door finally opened, and a man in surgical clothing entered the room. As if he had known Feeny, he headed towards her. As he stepped into the light, Renee saw that it was the surgeon who had operated on Feeny. "Hello, Mrs. Weingarten, how are you?" his encouraging voice sounded. "Thanks. I'm still a little tired from the chemo, but otherwise I'm fine. I wanted to come to you today to discuss the two tumor values that we took post-operatively and during the first chemotherapy sessions. I've also finished the surgical report, but we're still waiting for further histological results because we've requested a follow-up examination of the cell structures." His tone was firm and rather confident. He grabbed a stool to be closer to Feeny, partly because he could talk to her more quietly without the other chemo patients overhearing. "Your CA-125 value before the operation was, as you know, 1,230. Feeny interrupted and asked Renee to write down the values. "It's not the figures themselves that are decisive," he said, "but rather the dynamics that are reflected in the different figures. Because there are women who have a much higher CA value with their findings, others with a lower one. So when you talk to other patients, please don't compare the absolute figures, but rather the further course of these numbers. Post-operatively, we had measured 710. After the first chemo, the CA value fell further to 360. After the second, it fell again to 200. And after the third, to 130. So we can assume that the value will continue to fall significantly after today's chemo. And this means that the chemotherapy seems to be working pretty well for you. And we are also happy that none of the known side effects and toxicity have appeared so far." Feeny had tried to follow, but couldn't keep count. She had been able to gather from the sound of the voice that doctor had good news for her. "So far, we are satisfied and will continue with a planned dose of chemotherapy. Toxicity often manifests itself right at the beginning, even if complications can occur later. But for now, it looks like we will continue with the therapy for the next few weeks. Do you have any questions?" The words ran hot and cold down Renee's spine. In front of him appeared the websites he had read intensively, and which, in his layman's opinion, reported on the therapy's low chances of success, including the high number of women who suffered from unspeakable side effects, and for whom the therapy dose had to be reduced. Neither Feeny nor Renee had dared to ask the doctor anything. Feeny seemed to be one of the lucky 30%, Renee thought. Even though Feeny couldn't quite understand what had just happened to her, as only a few numbers had been put into the room, she grabbed Renee's hand and felt his excitement and joy, which she allowed to infect her. It seemed that the most difficult start to the day since her diagnosis ended would end with the happiest outcome she could have even dreamt of. Feeny was suddenly awake, rose from her chair, threw on her coat, grabbed her bag, and walked out of the chemistry room. Renee followed her, and even before they stepped onto the stairs, they threw themselves into each other's arms. They were still cautious because of Feeny's stomach scar and couldn't dance together, but they swayed with happiness, kissed, and saw a future for the first time in weeks. Tears ran down their cheeks again, tears of joy this time, tears of relaxation, and tears upon tears. For the first time since the operation, Feeny walked down the stairs faster than usual and only held herself back from skipping the last few steps with great self-discipline. When she reached the bottom, however, she let out a cry of happiness, even though she immediately winced as she felt the pressure on her scar. "I'll buy you a cappuccino," was her response to this pain. "The things you have to go through with me, I just want to thank you," she said. "Feeny, that's wonderful. But actually, I have to thank you, me and the kids. I don't know which of us would have the strength, tenacity, and fortitude to take on what you do, especially after this morning." "Shh," she said, "our secret. You promised not to tell the children. I'm so ashamed. But I want them to know that their mom is trying to do everything she can. But for now, let's celebrate. Maybe the therapy is working." René's voice failed him, tears of pain and joy still streaming down his cheeks, struggling with her tears. Feeny wiped his, snuggled up to him, kissed the tears away, pressed herself against him, and tried to catch him. René couldn't remember how they had spent the evening, but only dimly he remembered that the children didn't need to ask when he picked them up from school, and at home, Feeny had prepared dinner, enough for the children to feel that everything seemed to be going well. Thank you for listening. And if you like, subscribe to this channel and you will hear more.